What if I told you that one of the biggest failures in history was actually the secret to an empire's greatest success? Sounds impossible, right? Well, let's talk about Britain continuously. Picture the world in the 1760s. Britain is on top of the world. It's just won a massive global war against its arch-rival France. Its American empire is at its absolute peak. But then, the unthinkable happens, the American Revolution. After 8 long, brutal years of war, the world's greatest superpower is forced to surrender. America is lost. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a loss. This was a failure on a scale Britain had never seen before. First, territory. For 300 years, Britain had done almost nothing but expand. This was the only major territory it ever lost. Then, the military. From the Spanish Armada all the way to World War II, Britain almost never lost a major war. This was its only real defeat in 350 years. So this should have been a knockout blow, right? The end of the empire? But here's the incredible part. It wasn't. Just a few years later, the British were expanding faster than ever, almost like nothing happened. How? How is that even possible? Welcome to my channel, The Deep Code of British Rise. Here, we don't just tell history. We decode the deep secrets behind the rise of the British Empire. In every episode, we explore the institutions, strategies, and forces that shaped one of history's greatest powers. Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic chapters of British history, the American Revolution. The answer to that puzzle lies in a brilliant strategy that we're calling failure management. Britain didn't just accept defeat. It had a playbook. It cut its losses, shifted its resources, and rebuilt its entire game plan. And that's our story for today. Not the war itself, but the playbook for what came after. This is the story of how a great power turned its greatest failure into its biggest win. So before we get into how Britain managed this epic failure, we have to ask the most obvious question. Why did America rebel in the first place? If you're like most people, your mind probably jumps to one famous phrase, no taxation without representation. The story we all learn is of a greedy British king taxing the American colonists into poverty, who finally rise up against their oppressors. It's a great story, simple, powerful. There's just one problem. It's not really true. The reality is, British rule in America was surprisingly light touch. The colonists actually had more political rights than many people back in Britain itself. The idea of political slavery just doesn't fit the facts. Okay, so what about economic exploitation? Surely that was the reason? Hardly. Let's look at the numbers. The 13 colonies combined paid about £1,400 in taxes per year. No, that is not a typo. 1,400. For comparison, people living in Britain were paying around £2 million in taxes every year. And get this, the tiny British sugar islands in the Caribbean, they were generating almost £4 million a year for the empire. That's thousands of times more than all of North America. The reason is simple. The Caribbean was full of massive, profitable sugar plantations. North America was mostly small farms. It just wasn't the economic powerhouse of the empire. When we say the American colonies were successful, we mean they were politically stable and well-governed. They were not big moneymakers. That £1,400 in tax barely even covered Britain's own administration costs. All right, so if it wasn't about the old taxes, what about the new taxes that we always hear about? It's true. After the 7 Years' War, Britain introduced 6 new taxes. But after protests, they quickly repealed 5 of them. The only one left was a small tax on tea, and its main purpose was symbolic. It was just Britain's way of saying, we still have the right to tax you. So if it wasn't about political oppression, and it wasn't really about being exploited, what was left? What was the real reason for the revolution? The answer lies in a powerful contradiction, a mismatch between two very different ideas. political freedom, and economic control. On the one hand, Britain had given the colonists incredible political freedom. They had their own local governments, a strong sense of being masters of their own destiny, and they even had total ownership of their land, something incredibly rare at the time. Politically, they felt like they were in the driver's seat. But on the other hand, Britain kept them on a tight economic leash. London decided what businesses they could be in, who they could trade with, and what they could sell. During a war, they were forbidden from trading with Britain's enemies, even if it meant a huge profit. And that was the ticking time bomb. You have a population that has been raised to think of themselves as the freest people on earth, but they are trapped inside an economic system they don't control. Politically, they were adults. Economically, they were treated like children. This explosive conflict, between a mind that felt free and a wallet that was chained, was the real spark that ignited the American Revolution. For a deep dive on this, the historian Andrew O'Shaughnessy's book, The Men Who Lost America, is a fantastic read, exploring the war from both the British and American sides. Part 3. Britain's Strategic Stop-Loss, a Rational Choice. So if the American Revolution wasn't a simple story of good versus evil, what happens when we look at how it ended? The war technically started in 1775, but after the decisive Battle of Yorktown in 1781, Britain essentially stopped sending new armies to America. Peace talks began, and Britain eventually recognized American independence. On the surface, it looks like Britain just gave up. But in reality, this was one of the most calculated and rational decisions in the history of the empire. It was a perfect example of a strategic stop-loss. Think of it like investing in the stock market. When a stock you own is crashing, and you know it's not coming back, the smartest thing to do is to sell it and cut your losses. No matter how painful it feels, you do it to prevent an even bigger disaster. That's exactly what Britain did after Yorktown. Their decision was a cold, hard calculation based on 3 key factors. First, they shifted their focus to the global chessboard. The British leadership had to face the facts. After 8 years of war, the hearts and minds of the American colonists were lost for good. Trying to hold on by force would be a long, bloody, and incredibly expensive affair with no guarantee of success. More importantly, Britain had a massive global empire to run. North America was just one piece on the board. By cutting their losses there, they could free up precious troops and money to protect their truly valuable assets, like the wildly profitable sugar islands in the Caribbean and the enormous potential of India. They chose the long-term health of the empire over a single losing battle. Second, they identified their real enemies. Britain knew its fight wasn't just against the colonial militias. There were 2 layers to this war. The opponent on the surface, the 13 colonies fighting for their independence. But the real opponents, the ones pulling the strings from the shadows, that was France and Spain. These old European rivals weren't helping America out of the goodness of their hearts. They were playing a much bigger game of geopolitical chess. For them, the American Revolution was the perfect opportunity to get revenge on Britain for past defeats, to drain its treasury, and to weaken its global power. In this grand imperial struggle, an independent America was just a tool to bring Britain to its knees. And third, the absolutely unsustainable financial cost. Ultimately, this all came down to the money. The American war had become a catastrophic drain on the British treasury. The numbers are staggering. Britain's military spending on the war was around £250 million. To put that in perspective, their government's entire annual income was only about £12 million. The war cost them more than 20 years of their total national revenue. Meanwhile, France spent around £104 million, and America spent somewhere between 20 and 30 million. The numbers don't lie. Britain was being forced to outspend everyone. France and Spain were all in, and their goal was to bleed Britain dry. So when you put it all together, a cause that was already lost, two powerful European empires pushing all their chips in, and a national treasury on the brink of collapse, the choice becomes clear. This wasn't an emotional surrender. It was a rational, reality-based decision. To protect the wider empire, Britain had to cut its losses and walk away. It was the only move left on the board. So Britain had successfully cut its losses. A smart move. But what came next was more than smart. It was brilliant. This is the second part of their failure management playbook, rebuilding the entire structure of their interests. Think about it. Once you've admitted defeat, what do you do with your former enemy? Do you hold a grudge? Do you treat them with suspicion? Britain's answer was clear. The new independent America was weak. It wasn't a threat, so why treat it like one? In one of the most remarkable turnarounds in diplomatic history, Britain decided to turn its former enemy into a new partner. And there is one incredible scene that captures this perfectly. In 1785, John Adams, one of the main leaders of the rebellion, arrives in London as the first American ambassador. Imagine being in that room. The chief rebel is now face to face with the man he rebelled against, King George III. But instead of hostility, the king meets him with incredible dignity. He tells Adams that while he was the last to agree to America's independence, he would be the first to meet its friendship. This wasn't just polite diplomatic talk. This was the signal for a complete strategic reset. Almost immediately, trade between Britain and America exploded, quickly becoming even bigger than during the colonial era. Now, it wasn't always a smooth ride. The War of 1812 saw them fighting again, but even that conflict couldn't break the powerful economic ties between them. Britain had lost direct political control, yes, but through trade and finance, it established a new invisible kind of influence. For the next century, America's industrial growth was heavily dependent on British money, British technology, and British markets. But Britain's vision wasn't just limited to America. This is where the great pivot begins. Having lost its prized possession, Britain rebalanced its entire global strategy. First, it consolidated its control over Canada, turning it into a strong, loyal anchor in North America. And then, it shifted its focus to the East. The energy, the investment, and the ambition that once went into America was now redirected toward India and Asia. Britain massively expanded its colonial rule in India, and by 1842 had forced open the markets of China. Losing America didn't cripple the British Empire. It forced it to evolve. So, when you look at Britain after the Revolution, you aren't looking at a loser. You're looking at an empire that knew how to cut its losses and, more importantly, how to pivot. After losing political America, it held on to economic America, while securing Canada as a strategic base. This incredibly flexible strategy gave rise to what historians now call the Second British Empire, an empire built not on America, but on India and global sea lanes. And this new empire was what allowed Britain to truly reach its peak in the 19th century, becoming the empire on which the sun never set. So when you piece it all together, a remarkable picture emerges. What looked like a catastrophic defeat for the British Empire was blunted, managed, and ultimately turned into a strategic advantage. The genius of the British Empire wasn't just in how it won, it was in how it managed to lose. Losing America should have been a fatal blow, but by using that three-step playbook, cutting its losses, rebuilding its partnerships, and pivoting to Asia, Britain didn't just avoid a rapid decline. It actually laid the foundation for its most powerful era. And this skill, this ability to manage failure, became a core part of the British imperial identity for the next 200 years. Think about it. Most great empires in history don't just decline, they collapse. Suddenly, violently, leaving chaos behind. But the British Empire's decline was different. It wasn't a sudden crash. It was a long, slow, managed descent over decades. And that perhaps is a story worth thinking about. Because in the end, that logic of failure management is a universal lesson, whether you're a nation, a business, or just an individual. The ability to cut your losses decisively, adapt wisely, and strategically rebuild, that is the most reliable way to overcome any failure. And with that, Britain's chapter of North American expansion comes to a close, but it also opens the door to our next story. We're going to look at one of the most powerful tools Britain used in its global expansion, a revolutionary corporate invention that still shapes our world today, the giant joint stock company, and its most famous and fearsome example, the East India Company. If you enjoyed decoding that piece of history with me, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps, and I'll see you in the next episode.